Whenever a game arrives, I shred the plastic on the outside, open the box, and then move through all the bits. I'll take a quick look at the rule book, I'll take the cardboard sheets and pop out the cardboard chits, I'll take the cards if there's a deck and I'll remove the plastic from that. And generally, I just go through everything and make sure everything is organized in some way or another. I don't necessarily take the time to learn what the best optimization is for storage. I just try to put it in a way that makes sense. I just love this process. It not only introduces me to the components, but it also, I think, helps release the serotonin and dopamine that can occur when you have something new that you're bringing into your life. And not only that, I think it also helps with the transition from it being a product that had been on the store shelves and then was transported, and now it's part of my collection. It's not just placed to the side, still in the plastic wrap. It's now been at least Christian in some way through the process that is me bringing it into the catalog of my house. So Brass Birmingham arrived back in 2019, and it was a pretty giddy experience. I enjoyed going through the plastic poker chips. There were just tons of little components all over the place, and there was these little barrels that were bear barrels, a bunch of cubes, and there's just a lot in there, and it was jam-packed, and it was pretty exciting just to try to figure out what it all was. But also to say it was a little intimidating. I mean, in my past, I've played a lot of the heavier Euro games, so that wasn't necessarily the factor, though sometimes when you embark upon the path of learning a new game, it can be something you just sit down and kind of really settle in and think about, and then you have to think about how you've internalized it enough in order to then explain it to other people in a way that they could follow. So it's quite a process, and so I giddily went through all these components, and then it just wasn't the right time to introduce my friends to the game. We were at the time already engaged with Root. I think we had played Concordia once or twice. I had introduced some people to Tigris and Euphrates, which I had played years ago, and there was just a lot already on the table. There was still kind of the remaining undulating ripples of interest for Scythe, among other games, and so it just kind of was put to the side. And then the pandemic hit, and it just wasn't a game that seemed like it wasn't the right time. And I'll also say that just the concept of a train game and economy-based, and it just felt like kind of math-heavy. I just wasn't sure it was something that I really was that excited about. I bought the game because, I had read wonderful things about it. I had just knew that it was a very popular game, and I had a feeling that it would be something that once I actually sat down and engaged with that I would enjoy. But it just seemed kind of like a laborious process, and just looking at from a superficial level, it just seemed a little dry. So it didn't call out to me the way that some of the other games that I decided to embark upon did. So the game just sat on my shelf. It was, in my old place, I had kind of my main area of games, and then I had a side area, and then I had the deep storage in the closet. And it never quite made it all the way to the closet, but it did largely go out of sight, out of mind within the main area of my living domain. So when I relocated and set up a new spot in which I'd place my games, I said, okay, I'm going to put this game because I want to learn it, I want to play it, people seem to love it. I'm going to put it in a very prime location. I'm going to see it every time I go to my office where I work and also where I often game. And I'm just going to make sure that every day I'll have that guilt, like eye level, I'll be staring it down, it'll be staring me down. And so Kelly and I have been going through kind of the shelf of shame. She's been helping me just learn the games that had been sitting on the shelf that I just never got to. And so we had done a few of those, like Paladins of the West Kingdom was one, Feast for Odin, and so on. And then, so lo and behold, I said, okay, I think now is the time to figure out how to play this game. And it's actually not that complicated. There's some kind of fiddly interactive rules, but they make intuitive sense once you get the theme down. And I don't think it's actually that heavy. And I don't know that on any given turn, it's even that complicated what you may choose to do. There's only so many actions, and there's only so many possibilities on any given moment. You can still plan ahead, and there's still a lot of depth to the game, but I don't think it's something that you necessarily need to have too much analysis paralysis for. And I think a lot of times you can actually plan your turns a little bit while someone else is playing, and then when it's your turn, you can then embark upon your plan. Like I often know, like my next 6 actions I want to do, it's just making sure I can do them. And I will caveat that by saying that the game is, and I'll get to this in a moment, very dynamic, and it's this odd way of being interactive where you can purposely try to hurt people, or you can also happen to just do so because your interests happen to take up and prevent in some way what they were going for. But I find that you can always still, for the most part, adapt. So it's very free flowing. It kind of reminds me, not quite as chaotic, but has something similar to innovation, where you just go along for the ride, take what you can. Though here I think there is some ability to plan a little bit more, at least as a newbie, because like innovation, just to go as an aside, that's a game where every card is unique and there's a lot of chaos, so knowing all the cards really gives you a benefit for planning for the chaos. Whereas here I don't think that's much of an issue. And I'll say also in terms of the card distribution, they give you a little handy guide that lets you know how many of each card are in play based on the number of players you have. So you can kind of plan ahead and play the odds. That said, from my understanding of transportation games, they are generally a mishmash of resource manipulation, area control, being efficient with economy, and all of that has this tingling excitement to it, but also some of it just feels like it could be a little laborious. Like, I use my mind quite a bit for my job, and I feel like just life itself is kind of engaging. And so sometimes the thought of something that's just very brain burnery, it has its appeal, but it's not something that calls out to me. Once I'm engaged in it, it's wonderful, but there's just kind of a threshold that I need to get past in order to dive into the gaming experience of that sort. So not only the fact that I had the game on my shelf and it was just staring me down, but also I ended up going Board Game Geek and just seeing what kind of game mechanics are in there that I may not be aware of. And the one thing I was really scanning for was Take That. That's just something that isn't a dynamic that's always that enjoyable, especially with Kelly and me, and it kind of depends on my group as well. I remember reading years ago, I think the designer for Dominion had mentioned that in the Take That kind of attack card scenario, his preference was if you had an attack, it should hit everybody. You shouldn't necessarily have to, pick one person that you actively want to harm. Like, that's one of the terrible parts of Catan, is that you just isolate people by putting the rubber on them. And the joke, and I can't remember if I stole this from someone or if it's a conglomeration of different sources, but like a game like that, you can just toss a few dice, hit your friends in the face, and then just move on. Like, you don't need to spend an hour doing that. And so when I saw that this game, based on the mechanics, didn't seem to have that aspect to it, I was like, okay, now's the time. And so put the game out and went through the process of reading the rules. I wasn't quite clear on some of the rules, so I turned to Rodney's video for the explanation just to make sure I understood how the actions worked, especially in terms of developing on spaces and then just some of the nuances with how the oil and coal resources work. But his video was great, and it helped me kind of cement some of the rules so then I could do the teach with Kelly and then actually play the game. Something that was great about our first experience playing the game is that we realized as we were doing things that it didn't make sense. Like, I mean, we were doing the rules correctly, but our strategy was just off. We didn't quite understand how the individual actions could like lead into the big picture. And I'm not going to really go into the rules of the game, but one of the main aspects you really need to do is every building you put on the board, you want it to flip to the other side, which is how you get points. And so there's different ways that buildings flip. Generally, there's an action called sell that you can do in certain situations that allows you to flip the building. And then there's other buildings that come with resources on them, when the resources are depleted, that's when the building flips. And so we had set up some buildings that we just weren't going to flip the first game, or it was going to be stressful to get to them, the criteria in place for it to flip. And so the first game was just, even the first part of the first game was just this learning curve. And then after that, I think I'm not saying we're masters of the game, because we obviously aren't, but I think having gotten this initial experience really informed our games. And I think every game we've played since, we've continued to improve and refine what we're doing. But it really only took one game for us to feel like we at least had some meaningful level of steepage of the rules and strategy. So that was something that I appreciated. For such a heavy, complicated game, you can really get into it quickly. It's not something like for Root at least, I felt like we had to play many games before we even got a handle on what concepts of strategy really were meaningful. And it wasn't always necessarily intuitive to all of us, especially given that you had to find what was intuitive for each of the different factions because of the asymmetry of that game. Whereas this, it was pretty straightforward pretty quickly. The game is like surprisingly interactive, which maybe it's not surprising, but what I love about the interaction here is that most of the time, even when you do something that kind of harms somebody, there's often a way they can still get around whatever you've done to block them. there's still, maybe it's not the ideal plan, but there's still often a way to continue. And there's some exceptions to that, but I think it's a general theme of the game. And I'll say that, and again, not really getting into the rules, but the idea is that all of the different cities can be connected. And so there's two kind of overarching terms of art, this idea of connection and this idea of network. So all the different links that are filled in, all the different buildings that are in cities, those across all the players form connections. That goes across players. But then you are also concerned about what's in your network, so that's just what you actually own that's on the board. And so when you want to grab the coal resource, you look at it as a connection. So you can go across your lines, other people's lines, and you're just looking essentially for where there's coal, whether it's your coal or somebody else's coal, or there's a way to get to this market where you can just exchange the board if there's no coal on the board that you're connected to. And so that's just like a way that makes the game not feel as cruel or unfortunate when you happen to be connected or blocked off by one of your opponents. And what also is kind of like just kind of silly and fun about this is when you look for coal on the board that you can use, you look for the closest coal to you. So someone can kind of, if you were planning on using your coal, someone can kind of swoop in, put coal that's closer to where you may build than where your coal is, and you'll end up using theirs. But even that's kind of fun because taking coal off a piece is ultimately beneficial for whoever is building it is. So if you get to your own coal, that's great because you get to oftentimes sell that coal back to the game itself, the market in the game, and make resources. But also, as I mentioned earlier, when you take off all of the resources from a cube, that it flips and then you get benefits from that. So if you really need coal, you can use your opponent's coal. You'll get a benefit in using their coal because you need it to build a building. So obviously it's better to use your own coal than someone else's, but it's not the end of the world. And in the later game, you make more use of the beer resource, and it can be very hard to even get the beer resource on the board. So at that point, it changes from the dynamic of being, I don't really want to use somebody's coal because I don't want to give them a benefit, to, oh, I really need beer wherever it is and I need to get to your beer. So I don't know, it's a very kind of not passive aggressive, it's not like directly aggressive, but there's still this large interplay where you can bum people out for a moment with what you did, but there's still a way to keep going. And I like that. It has a positive aspect to it, which makes the game fun and not feel personal, even if for a moment you're like, man, my plans just went to hell. I think I had that experience like 5 or 6 times the last time I played, but then even though that happened, I ended up, I think, winning that game. But so even though it took some points in one way, I was able to recover in other ways. And that just, I think, makes for a really good gaming experience. And another thing, while I'm talking about that idea of points and adapting, every game we've played, I think we've played this 4 times now, all the games have been close. Some games have been within a couple points. Like one time you can get points for putting connections down, and you can see how many points connections are going to be at certain points in the game. And I put down a connection where I thought it was the most valuable connection on the board that I could build on, and it turned out that it was not because I missed it, and then Kelly made that a connection I could have made. She got more of a point, and she ended up winning the game because of that differential between me getting 1 fewer point and her getting 1 more point. So that was pretty amazing, like in terms of really nail-biting scoring at the end. And we've also had games where like maybe we're 15 points different from each other, but even there you can do certain moves near the end of the game that net you a decent amount of points. So it's not like you feel like you're just getting blown out the whole game. And even if your scoring is behind on the track for a lot of the games, you can monitor the scoring at 2 points in the game. There's kind of like a midterm and a final. And so halfway through the game, there's like a changing room of the error where you switch from, I forget, I think it's like the Steam 8, no, I don't remember the name of the H's, but you switch from one error to the other, and one uses canals and the other one uses railroads. And you score whenever you do these changes, and then some of the tokens come off the board when you do the first change. So you can see where you are score-wise halfway through the game, and even if you're just far behind, you can still catch up. Like it's not one of those games, at least our experience thus far, where you're like 10 minutes into an hour and a half game and you're just like, I lost this game and now I just have to sit here and suffer. We haven't had that experience with this game, and that's wonderful because that's just such a travesty in games where someone just doesn't want to play anymore. And I think one of the things that a gaming group needs to do, and I'm not sure again if this is one of those games where this will eventually happen, but there's games where I think, especially if it's a two-player game, you just come to an understanding like this is not going well. Let's just end it. There's no need for me to, me or the other person to try to get the highest score possible. It's just let's move on with our lives. And that gets harder when you start having more players because two people need to agree that they're not going to win and then call it, or someone just has to be kind of nice and be like, well, I have a chance to win, but you over here are having a terrible time because you're obviously going to lose, so why don't we just call it? Like, I guess it'd be nice if we got into gaming groups like that where that was feasible. And that's something that I've been learning and getting better at. I know like a few years ago I was kind of insufferable because of my, even if I don't want to admit it, my desire to win. And I think that's something that is important in the games, is just to have a good time and not worry about it, and then even to kind of like be impressed when other people are successful, be impressed when you are successful in some way, and just generally just take it all pretty lightly, because at the end of the day it's fucking board games. Like it's not that important. So anyway, this game doesn't really seem to inspire, at least from my experience thus far, any feelings of just melancholy and depression because of the unfortunate way that the game may be going. Something that's I think is notable, I mean, sure there's many other games that have this dynamic, but I like that there's 3 different commodities that you deal with. There's oil, coal, and beer, and that they each have their own special rules on how you can acquire them, and then also to some extent how they're used. And I think that's fun. Like beer you can use no matter where it's on the board if it's yours, but if you want to use any other person's beer, you have to be connected to them. They don't have to be in your network, but they need to be in your connection. Iron, if it's on the board anywhere, you have to use that first. If not, you can always get it from the market. And then coal, you have to be connected to the coal. The game does a really good job with turn order too, because as I mentioned, you can really plan your turns ahead. And so the way it works is you generally, with the exception of the first turn of the game for each player, you always have 2 actions on your turn. And whatever money you spend during your turn, you put on your player marker. And the player marker indicates where you are in the turn order. And so at the end of every round where everyone has taken their turns, you then look to see who has spent the least money. And whoever has spent the least money gets moved to the front of the player order queue, and so on down the line. If there's a tie, you just stay in your position. And so what that does is it adds another complexity, because then you're thinking, when do I want to do actions? If I do this action now, I'll spend more money and then I'll fall back in the queue, and if I do that in the next round, someone may do something before me and it's going to cause problems. And so you're trying to like rush the board in terms of getting certain advantages before other people can get them, because the cost of coal and iron vary over the course of the game depending how much it's been bought from the market. So you want to take advantage of that. There's ways that you can replenish those resources back to the market, and you want to take advantage of that. So there's a lot of timing aspects in the game. So you're not only managing the board state, you're managing also which buildings you're hoping to build, and you're managing how much you spend on any given turn, because you might want to influence what your turn order is in the next round. And so if you time it right, if you were, as an example, last in one turn and you can make it so you're first on the next round, then you can actually end up having 4 actions in a row, which can be gigantic. And then conversely, if you spent the most and you're at the end of a round, and then you spend the most and you're at the end of a round again, then you're kind of always just falling behind a little bit in terms of getting at some of the opportunities that your opponents may be claiming before you. Something to mention about the game is that it has 2 different tracks that you're keeping an eye on. You're moving up an income track, and you use these little circles for that. And then there's also the scoring track, and for that, it actually comes with hexagons. And I will say that maybe there's some percentage of people that don't have this problem. It's very easy to grab the wrong marker and just mess up your score or your income without realizing it. So we ended up grabbing some meeples that are very different than a circle or hexagon, so that way it'll be much harder for us to grab the wrong token when we're updating our score. And I will say, even with that, I have made mistakes and have moved the wrong piece of wood, but I think in that regard I may be more of an outlier. But it was pretty silly that you start with things that are very similar for tracking these two different components. I would love to have a piece of wood that looks like a $sign and one that looks like a victory point, whatever that is. Apparently it's a cat for our board. But so that's something that I can imagine many people ending up doing. It's just finding different markers to use because it's just too easy to make mistakes as it is. So brass, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's not a short game, but it's one of those games where you don't feel like it's going on for a long time. It just doesn't feel interminable. It's one of those that there is a lot to do, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like there's that much to do. And I think that balance makes it so it stays interesting, paradoxically enough. It's not that you're just lost in a sea of options and you kind of lose focus, and it's not that there's no strategic space that you just get bored and every game feels the same. There's enough variety that arises because of the deck that you're using that helps you, that influences where you can build. There's also some parts of the market that get randomized each game, and there's generally different ways you can develop the city because you have these different tokens on your personal board that you're essentially trying to clear off to get to the more valuable ones that are available later. And so you can create many different kind of tech tree paths in your development process, and so that also keeps it fresh. The one thing that I think it gets less of an issue as you play the game is that because some of the rules are kind of riffs on themselves depending on the context, it can be easy to forget a few of the edge case rules, and it can also be easy to make mistakes when you're first playing the game. I think that all sorts out, and by the fourth game I think we both had the rules pretty nailed down, and so I don't think it's really an issue anymore at that point, and 4 games isn't that many, and maybe we solidified them a little before that. But I definitely was like obstinate about certain rules in the second game, saying, no, you can't do that, and then we realized that I was just misremembering and made a mistake, and so that was a little bit of an awkward bummer. But overall, it's not that hard to play. So I'm having a hard time finding things that are bad about it. I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't really like trains, you don't like economies, and you don't want to deal with the setup of a bunch of different chits all over the place, then that's totally reasonable. But in terms of what you're doing during the game, it's a lot of fun. And I've only played it as a 2-player game, and I can see how it would shine with more players because you'll just be really interacting more and leveraging each other's positions and resources that much more. So I'm pretty excited to expand and play with a larger group. So thus far it's been a wonderful 2-player game, and I can't speak highly enough of how much I've really enjoyed it. Like, I'm a little sad. We played the 4 games, now I think we're going to put it away and try some other games. Might do Viscounts next. I'm not really sure what I'm going to dabble in. But I will say that I kind of just want to leave it out and play it again. So yeah, wonderful game. I'd put it in a top tier category if you're in the needs of categorizing, and I do think it's fairly given the recognition that it has on Board Game Geek. I don't think this is an outlier. This is a very solid game. So thanks for watching. Please leave some comments. I'd love to engage, and take care. Thanks for watching.